Welcome back to the shadowed corners where science meets nightmare, where ancient organisms awaken to reshape the very fabric of human will. Tonight, we descend into the chilling chronicle of Las Plagas, the parasitic scourge that transformed a quiet Spanish village into a theater of biological subjugation. This is not merely a tale of infection, but of manipulation so profound that it questions the very nature of autonomy itself. A prehistoric remnant that slumbered in amber for millennia, only to be resurrected by zealots who dreamed of a world bound in absolute obedience. From the fossilized depths where it waited in patient dormancy to the neural networks it wove through spines and synapses, from the rural hamlet where farmers became foot soldiers to the island facility where global domination took shape, we will trace every thread of this parasitic tapestry. Whether you're encountering Las Plagas for the first time, revisiting this biological horror with fresh perspective, or simply surrendering to the narrative's dark embrace as sleep approaches, this comprehensive exploration will guide you through the complete, unbroken saga of one of Resident Evil's most insidious threats. Before we begin our descent into this world of neural hijacking and cult fanaticism, if you find this deep dive into biological horror compelling, consider leaving a like and subscribing to join our community of lore enthusiasts. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time has brought you to this particular corner of the Resident Evil universe? There's something fascinating about knowing that across continents and time zones, we're all connected by our fascination with these dark narratives, one video at a time. Now, let us begin. Long before the mountains of rural Spain echoed with the footfalls of tourists and researchers, long before the Salazar family built their castle upon the crags overlooking forgotten valleys, Las Plagas existed as silent passengers in the Earth's hidden strata. These parasitic organisms belong to an ancient lineage, their origins tracing back through geological ages to a time when the continents themselves wore different faces. Fossilized evidence suggests their journey began in ancient African deposits, possibly in regions that would one day be associated with the Ndipaya kingdom, though their story extends far beyond any single civilization's rise or fall. During the Neolithic era, as early human societies were just beginning to cultivate the land and build permanent settlements, these parasites made their way across prehistoric migration routes to the Iberian Peninsula. Carried perhaps in the digestive systems of long-extinct megafauna, or transported through geological processes we can only speculate about, they found their way into the mountainous cave systems of what would become Spain. There, in environments characterized by low oxygen levels, stable temperatures, and isolation from the surface world, the eggs of Las Plagas underwent a remarkable transformation. Sealed within pockets of limestone, surrounded by dripping calcite deposits and mineral-rich water, they desiccated into amber-like nodules that preserved their genetic potential across thousands upon thousands of years. The first human encounters with Las Plagas are shrouded in prehistoric mystery, but archaeological evidence provides tantalizing glimpses. Cave paintings from the Bronze Age, discovered in sites like the fictional Wharf B, depict scenes that archaeologists initially interpreted as ritual sacrifice. Crude etchings show human figures doubled over in postures of agony or supplication, their bodies rendered with peculiar attention to the spine and head regions. Surrounding these central figures are symbols that might represent the parasites themselves, spiral patterns, branching structures that could symbolize the neural networks the organisms create within their hosts. These ancient peoples, working with stone tools and firelight, somehow recognized the threat that lurked in certain cave systems. Whether through tragic experimentation or observation of infected animals, they understood that something in those depths could fundamentally alter a person. The paintings suggest attempts at containment, propitiation, perhaps even worship. Some figures in the artwork appear to be building walls or rolling stones across cave entrances. Others seem to be making offerings, possibly attempting to appease what they perceived as a malevolent earth spirit or deity dwelling in the darkness below. What makes Las Plagas particularly remarkable from a biological perspective is its extreme resilience in the dormant state. Unlike most parasitic organisms, which require relatively specific environmental conditions and have limited viability outside a host, Las Plagas eggs can endure extremes that would annihilate conventional life. This adaptation stems from their arthropod origins. They share certain characteristics with extremophiles, organisms that thrive in volcanic vents, deep-sea trenches, and other environments hostile to most life. The amber-like encasement that forms around dormant eggs provides protection from desiccation, temperature fluctuations, and even mild radiation exposure. In essence, these organisms evolved not for rapid conquest, but for patient survival, waiting out unfavorable conditions that might span not just years but entire epochs. The Salazar family enters this ancient story during the medieval period, their involvement beginning not as collaborators with the Parasite but as its most dedicated opponents. The family lineage traces back to a crusader knight named Gregorio Salazar, who lived during an era when Christianity was establishing dominance across the Iberian Peninsula, displacing older pagan traditions. In the valleys below what would become the Salazar Castle, isolated communities maintained religious practices that predated Christian influence. These communities, according to fragmentary historical records preserved in the Salazar family archives, revered Las Plagas as a sacred gift, a means of achieving spiritual communion and collective purpose. Gregorio Salazar viewed these practices as heretical abominations. Leading a military force composed of fellow crusaders and local converts, he waged a brutal campaign against the pagan communities. The conflict culminated in a decisive battle where Gregorio's forces drove the infected worshippers into a specific valley location. Rather than pursuing them further, Gregorio implemented an ambitious containment strategy. His men constructed a massive earthen mound over the area where the infected had gathered, essentially entombing them alive. This mound was then reinforced with elaborate engineering trenches to divert water flow, stone reinforcements to prevent erosion, and watchtowers positioned to observe any signs of breach. What Gregorio accomplished was simultaneously an act of mercy and horror. He could not destroy the parasites the infected were too numerous, too dangerous to engage in prolonged combat, and the nature of Las Plagas itself was not fully understood. Instead, he created a prison, a sealed environment where the parasites would be cut off from new hosts, where the infected would eventually perish, and where the eggs would return to dormancy in the absence of disturbance. The mound became a grave, not just for the people who died there, but for the parasites themselves, pressed back into the earth from which they had emerged. The Salazar family's role transformed from crusaders to wardens. Generation after generation, they maintained vigilance over the mound. Family records, carefully preserved through centuries, document this hereditary duty. Sons were taught by fathers about the evil that slumbered below, about the signs to watch for unusual seismic activity, changes in local wildlife behavior, mysterious illnesses among livestock. The knowledge was encoded in family law, etched into stone tablets that lined the castle walls, recorded in estate ledgers alongside mundane matters of taxation and land management. The burden of guardianship became as much a part of the Salazar identity as their noble titles and ancestral lands. For roughly 8 centuries, the containment held. The mound stood as a forgotten landmark in the rural landscape, gradually covered by vegetation, its true purpose fading from common knowledge. Local legends persisted, stories of cursed ground, warnings about strange dreams experienced by those who camped too near the site, but the specific threat of Las Plagas dissolved into the general folklore of the region. The Salazar family's vigilance gradually relaxed from active monitoring to passive tradition. By the time the 20th century arrived, the duty had become more ceremonial than practical, a historical footnote in the family's long and complex history. Yet beneath the soil, pressed under tons of earth and rock, the amber-encased eggs endured. The organisms within existed in a state of suspended animation, their metabolism reduced to nearly imperceptible levels, their genetic material preserved in crystalline matrices that would remain viable for thousands of additional years if left undisturbed. They were not dead, they were waiting for disturbance, for the return of conditions that would allow them to resume their interrupted life cycle, waiting for someone to break the seal that Gregorio Salazar had imposed so long ago. The biological mechanics of Las Plagas represent a masterwork of parasitic evolution, a system so sophisticated that it blurs the line between biological weapon and naturally occurring organism. Understanding how these parasites function requires examining their complete life cycle, from the moment of implantation through the various stages of maturation and the ultimate establishment of neural control over the host. The process begins with an egg, roughly the size of a small pearl, with a translucent outer membrane that reveals the coiled larval form within. Implantation can occur through several vectors. The most controlled method, favored by Los Illuminados cult members, involves direct injection via syringe, typically into the abdominal cavity where the egg will have access to the rich blood supply and warm internal environment needed for initial development. Alternative infection routes include oral ingestion, where the egg is consumed with food or drink and passes through the digestive system before hatching in the stomach or intestines, and in rare cases, direct insertion into existing wounds or surgical sites. Once inside the host's body, the egg responds to the elevated temperature and chemical signals present in living tissue. The outer membrane begins to dissolve, a process that takes approximately 6 to 12 hours depending on the host's metabolism and immune response. During this gestation period, the host may experience their first symptoms, a sensation of warmth in the abdomen, nausea that resembles food poisoning, and a peculiar feeling of movement that most dismiss as digestive discomfort. The host remains functional during this phase, unaware that something irreversible has been initiated within their body. The larval emergence is perhaps the most disturbing phase for conscious hosts. The juvenile Las Plagas, now approximately the length and thickness of a human finger, forces its way upward through the esophagus and emerges from the host's mouth in a violent expulsion that resembles vomiting. This event typically occurs without warning. The host suddenly doubles over, convulsing, as the pale, segmented creature slithers free. The experience is profoundly disorienting and often accompanied by pain, though not typically lethal at this stage. The larva, slick with mucus and surprisingly motile, does not leave the host's body entirely. Instead, it immediately begins the next phase of its life cycle. With what can only be described as purposeful navigation, the juvenile parasite works its way back into the host's body through the nasal passages or ear canals, seeking the cranial cavity. This journey, which takes several minutes, causes intense pain and pressure as the organism literally burrows through soft tissue. Once inside the skull, the larva positions itself at the base of the brain before descending along the spinal column. Its target is specific, the junction between the brainstem and the cervical vertebrae, a location that provides optimal access to the central nervous system. The latching process represents the point of no return. The larva extends specialized tendrils, thread-like projections that are part neural tissue and part muscular structure, into the spinal cord itself. These tendrils, too fine to be seen with the naked eye, penetrate the protective membranes surrounding the cord and begin interfacing directly with the host's nervous system. The pain during this integration is described in surviving accounts as burning, electric, a sensation of the body being invaded from within. Most hosts lose consciousness temporarily, their bodies entering what cult documents call the awakening trance, a comatose state that can last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. During this crucial period, the parasite begins its true work. The tendrils map the host's neural architecture, identifying the pathways responsible for motor control, decision-making, emotional response, and memory formation. Unlike a conventional parasite that simply feeds on the host, Las Plagas integrates itself into the command structure of the body. It learns, in essence, how to operate the host from within. The sophistication of this process suggests millions of years of evolutionary refinement, or possibly, given the timeline inconsistencies in the organism's fossil record, genetic engineering by an intelligence we have not yet identified. As the larva matures over the following 24 to 72 hours, it undergoes metamorphosis into one of several adult forms, each suited to different roles within the infected collective. The most common mature form is the guadaña variant, named for its scythe-like appearance. This stage develops within hosts designated as standard infantry in the cult's hierarchy. The mature parasite, while still embedded in the host's spine, grows a specialized appendage that remains coiled within the cranial cavity until needed. When the host enters combat or experiences sufficient stress, this appendage can burst forth from the head in a grotesque display, extending several feet as a whip-like tentacle lined with barbed hooks. The guadaña form excels at mid-range attacks, able to ensnare targets and drag them closer or inflict lacerating wounds from a distance. The mandibula variant represents an adaptation for close quarters suppression. Instead of a whip-like appendage, this form develops a massive jaw structure, complete with powerful muscles and rows of teeth or mandibles. This horrific mouth erupts from the host's head or neck region, capable of clamping onto targets with bone-crushing force. The bite typically injects a paralyzing toxin produced by specialized glands within the mature parasite, a neurotoxin that induces temporary paralysis in victims without killing them outright. This adaptation serves a dual purpose, subduing threats and preserving potential new hosts for future implantation. The Aranya variant, the rarest of the three common forms, develops in hosts selected for reconnaissance and infiltration roles. Rather than a cranial protrusion, the Aranya form grows multiple spider-like limbs that emerge from the host's chest and back. These limbs, jointed and covered in a chitinous exoskeleton, grant the host extraordinary climbing abilities and jumping power. An Aranya-infected host can scale vertical surfaces, leap across gaps that would be impossible for a normal human, and navigate complex three-dimensional environments with uncanny grace. The limbs can also be used defensively, stabbing at close-range attackers or providing additional locomotion speed. The mechanism by which Las Plagas controls its host without completely overriding their personality represents perhaps its most insidious feature. Rather than reducing hosts to shambling zombies with no cognitive function, the parasite preserves most of the host's memories, skills, and behavioral patterns. A farmer remains capable of farming. A blacksmith can still work metal. A soldier retains combat training. This preservation is not mercy but strategy. The parasite leverages the host's existing neural pathways rather than building new ones from scratch. A far more energy-efficient approach that also allows infected individuals to blend into society undetected. However, the preservation comes with absolute override capability. When the parasite transmits a command, whether from its own survival instincts or from a dominant strain's directed signal, the host's conscious will is suppressed. They might be aware, in some distant corner of their remaining consciousness, that they are acting against their wishes, but they cannot stop themselves. Reports from individuals who were rescued after early-stage infection and subsequently treated describe the experience as nightmarish, watching through their own eyes as their body attacks loved ones, speaks words they would never say, follows orders they desperately want to refuse. The host becomes a prisoner in their own flesh. The neural link, established by Las Plagas, also enables a hierarchical command structure that mimics certain social insects like bees or ants. Subordinate strains, the standard parasites implanted in common cultists and captured villagers, are capable of receiving commands from dominant strains. These dominant variants, cultivated through selective breeding and enhanced implantation techniques, produce stronger and more complex neural signals that can influence multiple subordinate hosts simultaneously. A single dominant strain carrier can coordinate dozens of subordinate hosts, directing their movements, triggering their combat forms, and even controlling specific actions with remarkable precision. This hive structure transforms what could be a chaotic mob of infected individuals into an organized, militarily effective force. The life cycle's conclusion comes through one of several paths. If the host is killed and the parasite is not destroyed, it will attempt to continue its life cycle by producing eggs for dispersal. In some cases, the mature parasite will swell grotesquely, filling the host's chest cavity with developing egg sacs in a final reproductive push. When the host's body can no longer support this growth, it ruptures, releasing dozens of viable eggs into the environment. Alternatively, if the host survives long enough, the parasite enters a reproductive phase where it produces eggs that the host expels naturally through the mouth during ritualized baptisms, allowing for controlled propagation through the cult's ranks. Removal of Las Plagas from a living host is extremely difficult and was thought impossible until Luis Serra's research yielded the suppression serum. Without intervention, once the latching phase completes, the only reliable method of freeing a host is killing both the host and the parasite simultaneously. Surgical extraction is theoretically possible during the very early stages, but the window is narrow and the procedure requires precision that most field medics lack. The tendrils interface so intimately with the spinal cord that severing them typically results in permanent paralysis or death. This biological sophistication raises uncomfortable questions about Las Plagas' origins. While officially classified as an ancient parasitic species, the level of specialization, particularly the hierarchical control structures and the preservation of host cognitive functions, suggests a degree of optimization that purely natural selection struggles to explain. Some researchers who have studied the recovered samples theorize that Las Plagas may have been genetically modified by an ancient civilization, possibly the same Ndipaya people whose ruins contain the fossilized progenitor specimens. If true, this would make Las Plagas not merely a biological threat, but an archaeological one, a weapon system from a forgotten age, as dangerous now as the day it was designed. The resurrection of Las Plagas from its 8th century containment was not an accident of natural erosion or seismic activity, but a deliberate act of excavation, driven by the apocalyptic vision of one man, Osmond Sadler. To understand why someone would intentionally unleash such a threat, we must examine Sadler's background and the peculiar historical circumstances that enabled his plan. Osmond Sadler descended from the very pagan communities that Gregorio Salazar had crushed in the medieval period. His family lineage, preserved through carefully maintained genealogical records and oral traditions, traced directly back to the original worshippers of Las Plagas. While most descendants of those ancient practitioners had long since converted to Christianity and integrated into mainstream Spanish society, small pockets of belief persisted in isolated family lines. Sadler's upbringing immersed him in these traditions' secret gatherings where elders spoke of the sacred gift that had been stolen by Gregorio Salazar's crusaders, texts passed down through generations describing the spiritual unity that Las Plagas provided, and above all, a burning resentment at the suppression of their ancestors' faith. But Sadler was not merely a religious zealot clinging to old superstitions. He pursued advanced education in biology, theology, and history, obtaining doctoral degrees from European universities while carefully concealing his true beliefs. His academic research focused on parasitic organisms and their effects on host behavior, studies that appeared legitimate but were actually reconnaissance for his ultimate goal. He traveled extensively, studying similar biological specimens in other parts of the world, gathering knowledge about ancient civilizations that had experimented with parasitic and viral manipulation. By the early 2000s, Sadler had transformed from a bitter descendant into a sophisticated cult leader with the scientific knowledge to understand exactly what Las Plagas was and how it could be controlled. The revival of Los Illuminados, the Enlightened Ones, began subtly. Sadler returned to the rural regions of Spain where his ancestors had lived, establishing himself as a charismatic religious figure who preached a syncretic blend of traditional Catholicism and older pre-Christian elements. To the devout but impoverished locals, he offered community, purpose, and promises of spiritual fulfillment that the distant institutional church could not provide. His sermons spoke of enlightenment through communion, of humanity's potential for unified consciousness, of a paradise where conflict would end because all minds would share a single sacred purpose. The villagers, isolated in their mountain communities and struggling with economic hardship, found his message compelling. Simultaneously, Sadler cultivated a relationship with the current head of the Salazar family, the 8th Castellan Ramon Salazar. Ramon was in many ways the antithesis of his crusader ancestor, physically frail, afflicted with genetic disorders that left him with a childlike appearance despite his adult age, and deeply resentful of the diminished status his family had suffered over the centuries. The Salazar fortune had dwindled, the castle required expensive maintenance, and Ramon's own health problems made him desperate for solutions. When Sadler approached with promises of restoration, both of the family's glory and of Ramon's own body, the Castellan was receptive, Sadler's pitch to Ramon was masterful manipulation. He framed the mound not as a tomb of evil, but as a repository of sacred history that rightfully belonged to the Salazar family legacy. He showed Ramon ancient documents, some authentic and some forged, suggesting that the Salazar family's original purpose was not to contain Las Plagas, but to safeguard it for a future time when humanity would be ready for the unity it offered. He promised that if Ramon helped excavate the site, the parasites could heal his genetic afflictions, restore his vigor, and provide the power to rebuild the Salazar empire. For a man who had spent his life feeling weak and overlooked, the offer was irresistible. The excavation began in the early 2000s, funded by Ramon's remaining wealth and Sadler's cult resources. The operation was presented to local authorities as an archaeological dig, with forged permits and academic credentials providing cover. Workers were recruited from the most devoted cult members and from the local poor who needed employment and asked few questions. The dig site was located precisely over the ancient mound, with Sadler's historical research providing exact coordinates for where the concentration of parasites would be highest. Breaking through the layers of earth and stone that had sealed the site for 800 years took months of careful excavation. The workers, using modern equipment that Gregorio Salazar could never have imagined, cut through the hardened clay, limestone deposits, and structural reinforcements. As they penetrated deeper, they began encountering the first amber nodules, strange, translucent formations embedded in the soil that seemed to contain dark shapes within. Sadler identified these immediately as the desiccated eggs, still viable after their centuries of dormancy. These initial specimens were carefully extracted and transported to Ramon Salazar's castle, which had been converted into a research facility and cult headquarters. The castle's lower levels, particularly the dungeon areas that had once housed prisoners, were transformed into laboratories and incubation chambers. Here, Sadler and his scientifically trained followers began the process of reviving the parasites. The desiccated eggs required rehydration in carefully controlled solutions that mimicked the internal environment of a host body. Temperature, pH levels, and nutrient concentrations all had to be precisely calibrated. The first attempts failed, producing eggs that disintegrated or larvae that died shortly after hatching. But Sadler persisted, refining his techniques through trial and error, each failure teaching him more about the organisms he sought to master. The breakthrough came when Sadler successfully hatched a living larva and implanted it in a test subject, a willing cult member who viewed the experience as a sacred honor. The implantation followed the natural life cycle, and within 72 hours, the subject emerged as a fully integrated host, their personality largely intact but their will completely subservient to commands. This first successful ganado Spanish for cattle, a term Sadler chose to reflect the parasite's role in herding humanity, demonstrated everything Sadler had theorized. The host retained their skills and memories but obeyed without question or hesitation. With proof of concept established, Sadler accelerated the operation. The excavation site was expanded, with multiple teams working simultaneously to unearth as many amber deposits as possible. Some of these pristine eggs were kept for future cultivation, while others were immediately processed for implantation. Sadler developed a hierarchy within his cult based on parasite variants. He reserved the dominant strain specimens that showed unusually strong neural output in laboratory tests for himself and his most trusted lieutenants. These dominant implantations transformed the recipients into local control nodes, individuals who could coordinate and direct the subordinate hosts through the parasite's telepathic network. Ramon Salazar received one of these dominant strains, and the transformation was dramatic. His genetic disorders did not disappear. The parasite could not rewrite his DNA, but the organism's integration provided him with enhanced vitality, pain, suppression, and a sense of purpose that his life had previously lacked. Ramon became Sadler's most devoted ally, believing fully that the parasites represented humanity's evolutionary destiny. Under the combined leadership of Sadler and Ramon, Los Illuminados transitioned from a religious movement to a militarized cult with a biological arsenal. The subordinate strains were disseminated through increasingly elaborate rituals. Cult gatherings that had once featured standard religious ceremonies now included baptisms, where participants knowingly or unknowingly received parasite eggs in ceremonial chalices. The eggs were mixed with wine or dissolved in blessed water, their presence disguised by the ritual's solemnity. Participants drank, experiencing what they believed to be divine ecstasy, unaware that they had just been infected with an organism that would subjugate their will within days. For those who resisted or expressed doubt, forced implantation was employed, victims restrained, while syringes delivered eggs directly into their abdomens, their screams silenced by the cult's remote location and soundproof chambers. By the middle of the decade, the resurrection had woven Las Plagas into the fabric of the entire region. The small rural villages surrounding Ramon's castle fell under cult control as increasing percentages of the population became infected. The transformation was gradual enough that outsiders didn't immediately notice. Fields continued to be farmed, shops remained open, and the rhythms of rural life persisted on the surface. But beneath this facade, a hive mind was forming, a network of subordinate hosts all linked to Sadler's dominant strain, awaiting his commands. Sadler's ultimate vision extended far beyond the Spanish countryside. His communications to distant contacts, intercepted and pieced together during later investigations, revealed a geopolitical strategy of staggering ambition. He intended to use Las Plagas as a tool for global theocratic control, beginning with high-profile kidnappings and strategic implantations. Political leaders, military commanders, corporate executives, anyone with significant power would be targeted for infection. Once implanted, these individuals would retain their positions and abilities while secretly serving Sadler's agenda. The beauty of Las Plagas, from Sadler's perspective, was its invisibility. Unlike zombies shambling through streets or massive bioweapons destroying cities, infected individuals appeared completely normal, making the takeover subtle and potentially irreversible. The kidnapping of Ashley Graham, daughter of the United States President, represented the first step in this international escalation. If the president's own daughter could be infected and returned to the White House, the potential for infiltration was limitless. She would serve as leverage, forcing presidential cooperation under threat of activating her parasite. Or, if implanted long enough, she would become a conduit for further infections within the highest levels of American government. This calculated move drew the attention of the U.S. government and set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to Los Illuminados' downfall. But at the time, Sadler viewed it as his greatest triumph, proof that the resurrection of Las Plagas had succeeded beyond even his ambitious projections. As the excavation sites yielded their final harvests of amber and the castle laboratories refined their implantation techniques, the quiet hills of rural Spain became ground zero for a biological threat unlike anything the world had previously encountered. The resurrection was complete, the dormant scourge awakened, and Sadler's vision of an enlightened world united under parasitic control seemed terrifyingly within reach. The transformation of the rural Spanish village from a peaceful agricultural community into a stronghold of infected hosts represents one of Las Plagas' most disturbing features, its ability to corrupt existing social structures from within while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. The initial outbreak, if it can even be called that, unfolded not with the chaos of a zombie plague, but with the eerie quiet of gradual assimilation. The village that would become infamous in the Resident Evil Chronicles was typical of the region, a small collection of stone houses clustered around a central church, surrounded by agricultural fields and livestock pens, connected to the wider world by a single winding road through the mountains. The population numbered perhaps 200 to 300 residents, primarily farmers, craftsmen, and their families. These were people with deep roots in the area, some families having worked the same land for generations. Their lives followed seasonal rhythms, religious festivals, and the slow pace of rural existence far from Spain's urban centers. Los Illuminados' infiltration began with the most respected and influential villagers. The priest at the local church, already sympathetic to Sadler's religious rhetoric, was among the first to be implanted willingly. His transformation set the tone after integration. He continued his duties exactly as before, delivering sermons, performing marriages and baptisms, counseling parishioners, Nothing in his demeanor suggested the profound change that had occurred. His sermons, however, began to subtly shift, incorporating elements of Los Illuminados theology, praising unity and collective consciousness, preparing his congregation psychologically for what was to come. The village elders, influential family patriarchs and matriarchs whose opinions guided community decisions, were next. Sadler approached them through a combination of persuasion and demonstration. Some were shown the restored vitality that Ramon Salazar exhibited after his implantation, promised similar relief from the aches and limitations of age. Others were presented with the religious framework, the parasites, as a gift from a higher power, a means of achieving spiritual communion that transcended individual ego. For the more mercenary-minded, there were financial incentives, promises of wealth and importance in the new order that Los Illuminados would establish. Through various means, these influential figures were brought into the fold, implanted, and transformed into nodes of control within the village hierarchy. With the leadership compromised, the subordinate population followed with minimal resistance. Community gatherings, harvest festivals, and religious ceremonies became opportunities for mass implantation. The blessed wine served at communion contained dissolved eggs. The ritual meals shared during feast days were prepared with contaminated ingredients. Even the village's water supply, drawn from wells that could be discreetly seeded with larvae, became a vector for infection. The beauty of this approach, from the cult's perspective, was its passivity. Villagers were infected in the course of normal life, often without any moment of obvious violation. They simply woke up one morning with the first stirrings of a parasite beginning its journey toward their spine. For those who somehow avoided these mass infection events, or who showed resistance to the cult's ideology, more direct methods were employed. Ganados who had already integrated would visit holdouts at night, overwhelming them through numbers and restraining them for forced implantation. These abductions happened quickly and quietly, with the victims subdued, injected, and returned to their home before dawn. When they woke, confused and nauseated from the implantation, they would find themselves alone, with no clear evidence of what had occurred. Within days, as the parasite completed its integration, their resistance would evaporate, replaced by the same placid obedience that characterized their neighbors. The village's physical transformation lagged behind its biological one. On the surface, life continued much as before. Crops were tended, animals were fed, buildings were maintained, but subtle changes accumulated. Agricultural output shifted toward the cult's needs rather than market demands. Fields that had grown wheat for sale now produced vegetables for local consumption, ensuring the village's self-sufficiency. Livestock herds were culled, with only the minimum necessary animals retained. Tools and equipment were repurposed, or modified farming implements could double as weapons. Carpentry skills were redirected toward building fortifications and barriers at the village's access points. The most dramatic physical changes occurred in the church and certain residential buildings that were converted into cult facilities. The church's basement, traditionally used for storage, was expanded into a network of chambers for rituals and implantation ceremonies. Homes near the village center were emptied of their personal belongings and refurnished as barracks and command posts. The village's small clinic became a processing station, where newly implanted hosts could be monitored during their initial integration period. These modifications were accomplished quietly, often at night, by the infected population working with uncanny coordination. When Leon S. Kennedy arrived in this transformed village in the autumn of 2004, he encountered a community that existed in a liminal state between normal and nightmarish. His initial observations would have shown a seemingly ordinary rural village, smoke rising from chimneys, clothes hanging on lines, the outward signs of habitation. But the people, when he encountered them, were fundamentally wrong in ways that would take precious moments to recognize. They moved with purpose but without conversation. Their eyes tracked him with predatory focus. When they attacked, they did so with a coordination that ordinary mob violence doesn't possess, flanking maneuvers and tactical retreats executed without verbal communication. The ganados that confronted Leon represented the full spectrum of the village population. A farmer, wielding a pitchfork, attacked with the same methodical precision as a blacksmith swinging his hammer. An elderly woman threw Molotov cocktails with disturbing accuracy from a second-story window. A shopkeeper emerged from his store wielding a chainsaw, the tool he had once used for carpentry now directed at human targets with homicidal intent. These were not mindless zombies driven by hunger instinct. They were subordinate hosts executing commands, their retained skills and physical capabilities making them far more dangerous than any shambling corpse. The village's defenses reflected this intelligence. Barricades blocked the main road, funneling any visitors toward predetermined kill zones. Lookouts positioned in bell towers and rooftops provided early warning of intruders. Tripwires and crude traps, falling logs, hidden pits, explosive barrels positioned for tactical detonation demonstrated planning and construction ability. The Ganados patrolled in shifts, maintaining constant surveillance without appearing to tire. When confronted, they adapted their tactics based on the threat, using ranged weapons against armed opponents and closing for melee when they had numerical advantage. Perhaps most disturbing was the way the village maintained its facade of normalcy right up until the moment of attack. Leon's initial approach would have shown him a village that looked merely abandoned or sleepy. Only when he drew closer, when he entered homes and shops, would the truth become apparent. The silence where conversation should be, the coordinated movements where randomness should reign, and finally, the sudden, organized violence when he was identified as a threat. The outbreak's horror lay not in obvious monstrosity, but in the corruption of the familiar, the weaponization of everyday people in everyday spaces. The church stood as the outbreak's central node, the place where the village's religious and social life had always centered, now transformed into Los Illuminados' primary stronghold in the region. The building itself, a stone structure with Romanesque architecture dating back several centuries, acquired new significance as both a practical facility and a symbolic representation of the cult's power. Within its walls, Sadler and his lieutenants conducted the most important rituals, stored the most valuable parasite specimens, and coordinated the expansion of infected territories. As the outbreak matured through 2004, the village became less a human community and more a biological defense system, its Ganado inhabitants serving as sensory nodes and military assets in a larger network centered on Salazar's castle, the boundaries between individual and collective blurred, the village functioning as a single organism with hundreds of bodies, all directed toward the protection and propagation of Las Plagas. When the eventual confrontation with external forces came, this transformed village would serve as the first line of defense, demonstrating to the world what happened when a parasitic organism hijacked not just individuals, but an entire community's social fabric. The transmission mechanics of Las Plagas evolved as Los Illuminados refined their understanding of the organism and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for propagating the infection. Unlike viral outbreaks that spread through simple contact or airborne transmission, Las Plagas required deliberate delivery methods, giving the cult precise control over who became infected and when. This controlled transmission transformed the parasite from a chaotic plague into a strategic weapon. The primary transmission vector employed by Los Illuminados was ritualized implantation during religious ceremonies. The cult's gatherings, which attracted not only existing members but also curious villagers and even occasional outsiders seeking spiritual experiences, provided ideal opportunities for covert infection. The ceremonial chalice, a staple of Catholic-influenced rituals, became the delivery mechanism of choice. Parasite eggs were dissolved in wine or water, the liquid blessed by infected priests, who spoke of communion and unity, while secretly administering a biological agent that would ensure complete subservience. The preparation of these infection chalices involved careful cultivation practices. Mature hosts would undergo induced reproductive phases, where the parasite within them produced eggs. These eggs, expelled from the host's mouth during controlled sessions in the church's underground chambers, were collected in sterile containers and preserved in nutrient solutions until needed. For ceremonial use, the eggs were transferred to the communion wine in ratios calculated to ensure successful implantation while remaining imperceptible to the person drinking. The slight opalescent quality the eggs gave to the liquid could be attributed to the wine's quality or the candlelit ambiance of the ceremony. Recipients of these ceremonial implantations typically experienced no immediate distress. They would drink the chalice, participate in the remainder of the ritual, and return home believing they had undergone a purely spiritual experience. Only hours later would the first symptoms appear: the warmth in the abdomen, the nausea, the disturbing sensation of movement within. By the time the larval emergence occurred, usually during the night while the victim slept or lay in bed, it was far too late for any intervention. The host would wake in disoriented agony as the juvenile parasite forced its way up their throat and out their mouth, only to immediately burrow back inside to begin its neural integration. For targets who could not be lured to ceremonies, Los Illuminados employed more direct methods. Abduction teams composed of fully integrated ganados would identify and capture suitable hosts, travelers who had ventured into the region, resistant villagers who had avoided the ceremonial infections, or specific high-value targets like Ashley Graham. These victims were transported to secure facilities where forced implantation occurred. Restrained on tables in candlelit chambers that blended medical precision with ritual atmosphere, they received parasite eggs via syringe injection directly into the abdominal cavity. This method was more traumatic and less subtle than the ceremonial approach, but it was reliable and could be performed on unwilling subjects. The hierarchy of parasite strains added another layer to the transmission strategy. Subordinate strains, which comprised the vast majority of infections, were propagated through both ceremonial and forced methods with little discrimination. These strains were suitable for creating the rank-and-file ganados, who would serve as foot soldiers, laborers, and the basic infrastructure of the cult's power. Dominant strains, however, were reserved for leadership positions and were implanted only after careful selection and preparation of the host. The creation of dominant strain hosts involved a more elaborate process. The eggs themselves were cultivated from mature parasites that had demonstrated superior neural output and control capabilities in laboratory tests. The selected hosts underwent preparatory treatments, dietary regimens, physical conditioning, and psychological priming to optimize their bodies for integration. The implantation ceremony for a dominant strain was treated as a sacred event, attended by Sadler himself and conducted with elaborate ritual. The resulting host would possess not only the standard benefits of integration, enhanced strength, pain resistance, and connection to the hive, but also the ability to transmit commands to subordinate hosts within their sensory range. Sadler's own dominant strain represented the apex of this hierarchy. His implantation had involved the most carefully selected specimen from the initial excavation, a parasite of unusual size and complexity that suggested it might have been a queen or primary organism in the ancient infected communities. This strain gave Sadler command authority over all subordinate parasites within an enormous range, essentially making him the central consciousness of the entire infected network. When Sadler issued a command, it cascaded through the dominant strains to the subordinates, creating a top-down control structure as efficient as any military chain of command. Asexual reproduction within integrated hosts provided another transmission avenue. Once a subordinate strain reached full maturity within a host, it could enter a reproductive phase where it generated eggs internally. These eggs, produced without the need for a second parasite, were genetically identical to the parent organism clones that would create identical subordinate strains when implanted in new hosts. The host body would periodically expel these eggs through the mouth during group gatherings, with cult handlers collecting them for redistribution. This self-sustaining reproduction meant that Los Illuminados didn't need to constantly harvest eggs from the original excavation site. The infected population could generate its own supply. The cult's expansion strategy relied on carefully managed transmission chains. When moving into a new village or community, advance agents infected individuals who retained enough normal behavior to avoid suspicion would arrive first. These scouts would identify key community leaders, social hubs, and gathering places. They would establish themselves as merchants, laborers, or pilgrims, gradually earning trust. Once positioned, they would facilitate the arrival of more cult members and the introduction of parasite specimens into the community. The infection would spread from the top down, with influential figures infected first to smooth the way for mass transmission among their followers. One particularly insidious tactic involved contaminating commonly shared resources. Village wells could be seeded with parasite larvae that would survive in the water for limited periods. Communal grain stores could be infused with microscopic egg fragments that, while not viable for full implantation, would prime the population for later infection by altering their immune responses. Even livestock could serve as intermediate carriers, their feed contaminated with parasites that would make anyone who consumed meat from the animals more susceptible to subsequent implantation. For high-value targets like political figures or military officers, Los Illuminados developed specialized infiltration protocols. These involved extended surveillance to identify the target's routines and vulnerabilities, followed by carefully orchestrated scenarios where implantation could occur. A target might be invited to what appeared to be a legitimate diplomatic dinner where the wine contained eggs, or they might be abducted during travel through an isolated area, implanted, and returned with their memories of the abduction suppressed through trauma and the parasite's early influence on neural function. Days or weeks later, as integration completed, the target would become an unwitting asset, still performing their official duties while ultimately serving Sadler's agenda. Ashley Graham's abduction and implantation exemplified this high-value targeting approach. She was taken while in Spain on what appeared to be a routine educational trip, separated from her security detail through careful maneuvering by cult agents who had infiltrated her travel arrangements. The implantation occurred shortly after her capture, ensuring that by the time rescue operations could be mounted, her infection would be well advanced. Had the rescue not succeeded, Ashley would have been returned to the United States with a fully integrated parasite, creating an ongoing threat that could be activated at Sadler's discretion through the neural connection all subordinate strains maintained with his dominant one. The transmission mechanics of Las Plagas revealed it as a tool of calculated conquest rather than chaotic destruction. Every infection was a deliberate act, every new host a chosen addition to the hive. This precision made the outbreak both more controllable and more dangerous controllable because it didn't spread accidentally like a virus. Dangerous because it meant every infected person represented a conscious decision by Los Illuminados to expand their power. The parasite was not a disease to be cured through medical quarantine. It was a weapon being wielded by human agency, and stopping it required confronting not just the organism, but the cult that had weaponized it. The neural integration phase of Las Plagas infection represents where the parasite transitions from a biological invader to a consciousness hijacker. This phase, which begins as soon as the larva successfully latches onto the spinal cord, involves the gradual establishment of neural control while maintaining the host's surface functionality, a delicate balance that makes Las Plagas uniquely terrifying among parasitic organisms. During the initial hours after latching, the host experiences what survivors and cult documentation describe as the burning integration. The parasite's tendrils, having penetrated the spinal cord, begin rapid growth along the neural pathways. These tendrils are not simply physical structures, but bioelectrical conduits that can read and transmit nerve impulses. As they spread through the spinal column and into the brainstem, they map the host's neural architecture, identifying the pathways responsible for different functions: motor control in the motor cortex, emotional processing in the limbic system, decision-making in the prefrontal cortex, memory storage in the hippocampus. The pain during this phase is described as intense but strangely internal, a burning sensation that seems to originate from the spine itself and radiate outward through the nervous system. The host may lose consciousness repeatedly as the parasite makes particularly invasive connections, their body entering a catatonic state while integration proceeds. When consciousness returns, there is often confusion and disorientation. The host remembers who they are and recalls their past, but there's a disturbing sense of something else present in their mind, a passenger riding along with their thoughts. As the tendrils complete their mapping, the parasite begins selective intervention in neural function. It starts subtly, influencing mood and perception. The host may find themselves unusually calm about their situation, their natural panic response suppressed. Loyalty toward Los Illuminados and Sadler specifically feels increasingly natural and correct, while thoughts of resistance or escape generate discomfort. This is not brainwashing in a psychological sense. The host's memories and personality remain intact, but rather a direct manipulation of the neural pathways that generate emotional responses and value judgments. The retention of host memories and skills represents a crucial design feature of Las Plagas. Unlike organisms that simply hijack motor functions, turning the host into a shambling puppet, Las Plagas preserves and utilizes the host's accumulated knowledge and abilities. A farmer who spent decades learning crop cultivation retains that expertise after integration. A soldier maintains their combat training. A linguist can still speak multiple languages. This preservation makes infected individuals far more useful to the cult's purposes than mindless drones would be. However, this preservation comes with absolute override capability when needed. The neural interface allows the parasite, or more specifically, the dominant strain to which the subordinate is connected, to suppress the host's conscious will and directly puppeteer their body. During these override periods, the host becomes essentially a passenger in their own body, aware of what they're doing but unable to stop themselves. They might watch through their own eyes as their hands attack a loved one, hear their voice speaking words of loyalty to Sadler that they don't believe, feel their body moving toward objectives they consciously oppose. The psychological horror of this state cannot be overstated. Unlike complete unconsciousness or full personality erasure, which would at least spare the host awareness of their actions, Las Plagas keeps the person present and aware. They experience a form of locked-in syndrome where they can perceive but cannot control. Survivors who were rescued before full integration reported nightmares of the experience for years afterward, the memory of being forced to commit acts against their will while fully conscious being profoundly traumatizing. The hierarchical control structure built into Las Plagas' neural network enables the cult's organized operations. At the top sits Sadler with his apex dominant strain, capable of transmitting commands to every infected individual within an enormous range, potentially miles. Below him are the secondary dominant strains, implanted in lieutenants like Ramon Salazar and elite cult members. These individuals can receive Sadler's commands and retransmit them to subordinates within their local area, essentially serving as relay nodes that extend the range and precision of the control network. The subordinate strains that comprise the vast majority of infections are capable of receiving commands but not transmitting them. These infected individuals experience the control network as a persistent background awareness of the hive's state and an irresistible compulsion to obey commands transmitted through the network. When Sadler or a local dominant issues a directive, patrol the North Road, capture intruders alive, defend the church, subordinates receive it not as a voice they hear, but as a sudden, overwhelming conviction that this action must be performed immediately. It feels to them like their own idea, their own decision, even as some buried part of their consciousness recognizes the invasion. The communication between parasites occurs through bioelectromagnetic signals, a discovery made by Luis Serra during his research. The mature parasites generate weak electromagnetic pulses that are transmitted through the host's nervous system and can be detected by other parasites in proximity. These signals carry complex information, not just simple commands, but situational data, target identification, tactical assessments. When a ganado spots an intruder, the visual information is immediately shared across the local network, allowing other infected individuals to coordinate their response without any verbal communication or obvious signaling. This silent coordination manifests in uncanny ways during confrontations. Ganados will execute flanking maneuvers with military precision despite having no combat training. They'll set up ambushes at choke points without visible leaders giving orders. When one infected individual is killed, others in the area immediately know and adjust their tactics accordingly. The effect is of fighting not individuals, but a distributed intelligence that happens to inhabit multiple bodies, each body a sensory organ and manipulator limb of a larger consciousness. The integration reaches completion after approximately 72 hours, though this timeline can vary based on the host's physiology and the strain's vigor. At full integration, the distinction between the host's will and the parasite's commands becomes nearly imperceptible to the host themselves. They no longer experience commands as impositions but as natural desires, A fully integrated ganado genuinely wants to serve Los Illuminados, feels pride in their role within the collective, and experiences satisfaction when following directives. The preservation of their self-identity becomes almost irrelevant when their deepest motivations and loyalties have been rewritten at the neural level. This complete integration explains why integrated hosts don't simply appear as prisoners or slaves, but as devoted cultists. They participate enthusiastically in rituals, express genuine joy at spreading the gift of Las Plagas to others, and exhibit missionary zeal in defending the cult's interests. From their perspective, they have been enlightened, freed from the isolation of individual consciousness, and welcomed into a larger unity. That this unity is actually parasitic control enforced through neural hijacking is a truth they literally cannot process. The parasite has modified their ability to perceive the relationship critically. The network's range limitations and signal degradation over distance created certain vulnerabilities. Subordinates who move too far from dominant strains would experience a weakening of command authority, their natural personality, and will beginning to reassert itself slightly. In these edge cases, infected individuals might experience moments of clarity where they recognize their situation, though they typically lacked the ability to act on this recognition before drifting back under full control. Los Illuminados compensated for this by establishing a network of dominant strain carriers across their controlled territory, ensuring that subordinates were never far from a control node. The death of a dominant strain carrier created temporary chaos in the local network. Subordinates who had been receiving commands through that carrier would experience a sudden void, their directives becoming unclear. They would continue following their last received orders, but without new input, they couldn't adapt to changing situations. This vulnerability would prove critical during the eventual confrontation with Los Illuminados. Killing the dominant strain carriers could create windows of confusion that attackers could exploit. The ultimate manifestation of this vulnerability was that killing Sadler himself would theoretically sever the neural connection for all subordinates, though whether this would free them or simply leave them directionless remained an open question until the final confrontation. The neural network created by Las Plagas represented a perversion of the human social instinct for cooperation and community. Instead of individuals choosing to work together while maintaining their autonomy, the parasite created forced unity where cooperation was neurologically mandated. The result was an efficiency that voluntary organizations could never match, but at the cost of everything that made the participants human in any meaningful sense. They became tools, biological robots, operating under remote control, their preserved memories and skills merely making them more versatile instruments for Sadler's apocalyptic ambitions.